Good evening. I'm Judy Sternberg, President of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester metro area. And along with the League of Women Voters of the City of New York, we are proud to bring you tonight's forum, an examination of social media's impact on democracy and prospects for how that might be reformed. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that does not support or oppose any political parties or candidates. It encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League is open to anyone who shares our purpose and principles. Let me introduce you now to Diane Burrows, co-president of the League of Women Voters of the City of New York.
Thank you. I would like to introduce you all to our resourceful chair of the New York City League's Program Committee, Joanna Leifer. Joanna?
Now, about our speaker, be prepared. This man has done everything. Joshua A. Tucker is a multi-talented instructor at NYU. He is a professor of politics, an affiliate professor of Russian and Slavic studies, and an affiliate professor of data science. Plus, he is a director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia and the co-director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. I don't think you sleep, Joshua. When he's not teaching, he has co-authored, edited several award-winning blogs, including The Monkey Cage at the Washington Post. And his most recent book is the co-edited Social Media and Democracy, The State of the Field. Let me welcome you to Professor Joshua Tucker. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for the kind introduction. Thanks all of you for having me here tonight. And the title of my talk is Social Media and Democracy. Here's what just to give you a sort of brief outline of my remarks and what I'll be talking to you about over the next 45 minutes. And I just wanted to reiterate what was said before. If you have questions about my remarks, you feel free to use the Q&A button on the webinar to put in questions there, and we'll have a chance to do some Q&A at the end of the talk, today. So I'm going to begin by trying to give you a big picture view for thinking about social media and democracy. Then I'm going to segue into giving you quick summaries of 4 different really interesting things we've learned from really different research projects at the Center for Social Media and Politics. Hopefully along the way showing you the importance of rigorous scientific analysis of social media's relationship to various facets of the political world. And then I'll close, given that I was given the opportunity to talk about policy advocacy, I'll close by talking about what I think is one of the most important topics, a sort of meta overlying topic for all of these questions about the social media platforms in our political world, which is the importance of access to data for people who work not for the platforms, but who work in professions where they will put where they learn from analyzing this data into the public view and allow it to inform public policy. So that's where we're going to go over the next 45 minutes. So what I want to begin with is thinking generally, big picture, about the relationship between social media and democracy. Now, if we go way, way, way back in time, all the way back to say, 2011, when social media sort of first burst onto the political scene, when people started talking about social media and politics in relation to, in particular, the Arab Spring, but also things like the Gezi Park protests in Turkey, Occupy Wall Street in the United States, and various other movements. But when it first came onto the scenes, social media was called liberation technology. And it was referred to famously in the Journal of Democracy by the editor of the Journal of Democracy as liberation technology, because this was going to change the way that people were able to, who lived in authoritarian regimes were able to counteract the power of authoritarian governments by giving people a tool to communicate with one another that was outside the control of the government. So it was going to actually lead to the spread of democracy around the world. It was going to threaten authoritarian rule by its decentralized nature, by the way it worked across platforms and the way it was outside the control of states. Well, it didn't take long for that picture to sort of shift. And within 5 years, you had in the exact same journal, or within 6 years, in the exact same journal, looking back on the 2016 elections, you had Nate Persily publishing an article, Can Democracy Survive the Internet? So what we tried to do in this, when we thought about this in a piece that we wrote about this, is we tried to think through this question: is social media liberation technology, or is it can democracy survive the internet? Right? Is one of these viewpoints fundamentally wrong? And what we argued in an article that we called From Liberation to Turmoil was that actually it was both of these things. That if you make two simple assumptions, you can explain how social media can be both liberation technology and can democracy survive the internet. All right, so what are these two simple assumptions? The first assumption is that social media provides voice to people who don't have access to mainstream media, So what does that mean? Well, we'll kind of walk through what this means in different circumstances, but that can mean in authoritarian regimes, people who lack access to mainstream media might include other sort of anti-democratic authoritarian forces, but it almost undoubtedly includes those who want to change the authoritarian regime into a more pro-democratic regime. In democracies, people also can lack access to mainstream media, and we'll come to that. I'll come back to that in a second. So the first thing it does is that it can provide voice to people who don't have access to mainstream media. But our second assumption is, despite the fact that social media has undoubtedly democratized access to information, and we think this is something that is beyond a doubt right now. Social media has democratized access to information, but at the same time, it's still a tool that can be used for censorship. It can be used to silence voices. Okay, so how does this play out? So let's start with a new hope, liberation technology, right? Social media in authoritarian regimes. Who lacks access to social media? Who lacks access to mainstream media in authoritarian regimes? Well, as I said, this could be other authoritarian forces, but it undoubtedly includes members of pro-democracy movements, people who would like to see regimes change to a more democratic format. And what social media does in these cases is it gives an opportunity for pro-democracy activists to coordinate actions with one another, to find other pro-democracy activists, to plan protests, to plan movements against the state. So when we think about the context of authoritarian regimes, social media has this ability to be this very strong force in favor of democracy. However, these things don't happen in a vacuum. And when authoritarian regimes maybe have a blind spot when social media first appears on the scene, don't realize the kind of threat this could be, eventually they do respond. And so the sort of second phase of this, the Empire Strikes Back, is what we call repression technology. So what then ends up happening is that authoritarian regimes begin to think about how they can respond to online opposition. And there are a lot of different tools, and we've written multiple pieces about this at our center, about different ways in which authoritarian regimes can respond to online opposition. But among these includes the development and harnessing of technologies on social media. And this is where we begin to see the rise of what are known as bots, or automated accounts, or trolls, which are accounts that pretend to be one type of person and then act, but are actually being controlled by other actors. Sort of the most famous of which right now are the Russian IRA trolls in the 2016 US election, which we'll come back to later in the research part of the talk in just a little while. But we see these authoritarian regimes begin to develop tools. And these are tools that they are trying to use to silence people's voices online. They develop tools that are online and they develop offline. So in this case, social media can become a tool that authoritarian regimes can use to fight back against pro-democratic movements. Now, the final part is, let's think about how this begins to play out in democracies. So we've been thinking about how in authoritarian regimes, social media can give voice to pro-democratic opponents of the regime. Well, if we think about who lacks access to mainstream media in democratic societies, on the one hand, if you want to take a kind of Noam Chomsky sort of Marxist view of media being corporate interests and interests of the capitalist class, so you can think about progressive voices who are able to be heard because of social media that might be excluded from mainstream media. And we might think about things like Occupy Wall Street, or in particular, Black Lives Matter. But of course, in democracies, we, for the most part, extreme anti-democratic forces don't tend to have access to mainstream media. We don't tend to turn on the CBS Evening News and see Nazis, right, who are giving the reports of the news of the day. However, in democratic societies, the same exact tools, the affordances of social media, the ability to find like-minded supporters, the ability to coordinate without mainstream media, these tools can be used by anti-democratic forces. And so in democracy, the same tools that have helped pro-democracy forces and authoritarian regimes to organize can be used to help anti-democratic forces. And we call this sort of the rise of the anti-systemic forces. And most famously here, we have scenes now, most recently from Charlottesville and then from the Capitol insurrection. So the argument that we make in this piece is that actually social media itself is neither inherently good for democracy or inherently bad for democracy. Instead, social media is a tool that can be used by political actors along with lots of other tools that exist, but it's a tool that can be used by political actors to contest for power. And in some circumstances, that's a tool that can help democratic forces. In some circumstances, it's a tool that can help anti-democratic forces. So that's a kind of big picture way of thinking about the relationship between social media and democracy. Now, at this point of the talk, I have only given you sort of larger kind of theoretical arguments along with a few kind of anecdotal reference points to look at those arguments. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift into sharing with you research from the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU. And I'm going to share with you 4 things that we've learned from different research projects we've worked on that I think are particularly interesting and all within this vein of the relationship between social media and democracy. So I'm going to start with the question of fake news and look at who shared fake news online. Then I'm going to talk about social media and polarization, asking whether Facebook usage makes people more polarized. Then I'm going to talk a bit about hate speech online and specifically ask the question of, did hate speech on Twitter increase over the course of the 2016 election? And finally, I'm going to come back to what we talked about a minute ago, these bots and trolls. And I'm going to share with you what was the impact of exposure to Russian trolls on Twitter. And all of this is research from the Center for Social Media and Politics. The first 3 are from well, 2 of these are things that have been published already. 2 of these are works that are under review currently for publication at this time. And the bots and trolls one in particular is sort of very hot off the presses. All right, so let's begin our sort of travel through these various kind of threats of social media to democracy. And we're going to begin with the now sort of famous fake news. Although some don't like this particular tone, but we can talk about inauthentic news or news from imposter news, all sorts of different terms that people use. So the question that we were asking in our research was, who shared fake news online in the 2016 election? Now, scholars have done a lot of really interesting work before we published this paper about fake news in the 2016 elections, in the aftermath of that election. And we had learned a lot of interesting things about, in particular, who was exposed to fake news, who was producing fake news, but we knew very little about who had actually done the sharing of fake news during the 2016 election. So it turns out that this is a complex question to answer. But at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU, we realized in the aftermath of the 2016 US presidential election that we actually had been collecting data over the course of that election period that would let us answer this question. And the way we had been doing this is that we had collected, we had been running a survey over the course of the election period, where we were going back to the same people repeatedly over the course of the election to ask them questions in a sort of what's called a panel survey, where we spoke to people at the beginning of the election period, we spoke to them in the middle of the election period, and then at the end of the election period. However, at the same time, we had also asked people if they were willing to share with us their Facebook data. And actually, in a moment, I'll talk to you a little bit about another thing that we use this survey for, where people were sharing with us their Twitter data. Now, people on Facebook agreed, we had their full consent, but they agreed to participate in the study and to share with us things that they had posted on their Facebook pages. So we realized in the aftermath of the election that for this collection of people who we had survey data about, we knew things about these folks, and for whom we had their Facebook data, that we could actually answer the question of who was sharing fake news on Facebook over the course of the election. So this is the first thing that I want to show you that might actually be surprising, which is that it turns out that in our data, and we had about 1,400 people who had agreed to share their Facebook data with us, and we looked at the links that they had posted on their Facebook pages over the course of the 2016 election campaign. We used lists developed by other scholars that had classified suspect or fake news websites, so sites that shared fake news. And the first thing we found is that most of the people in our study did not share fake news at all. Actually, it turns out that over 90% of the people in our sample shared a sum total of 0 fake news stories. And what you see here, and it's a little bit hard to pick out of this figure here, but you can see it, even the bare shapes of it, is that this is called a power law. So this is essentially when you have very, very large numbers of people who are not engaging in behavior at all. And then you have small numbers of people who engage in large levels of this behavior. You'll see this again later on in the talk. This is something we find over and over and over again about the internet. And this is one thing that I would take to heart very seriously as you begin to hear things about what's happening on the internet, what the behavior that's happening on the internet, is that we find this again and again, that a behavior you might be hearing about, and it might be a behavior that troubles you a great deal, but that behavior may not be popular on the internet it may be popular on the internet in the sense that it's happening a lot, but it may not be popular on the internet in the sense that lots and lots of people are engaging in that particular behavior. And so, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure my timer stays on. Okay, all right, there we go. All right, and so the behavior, even though you hear about it happening a lot, it might be happening a lot. It may be happening in a way where lots of people are having no exposure to it, but that the behavior is concentrated in small numbers of people. So this is the first thing we found. 90% of the people in our sample didn't share any of the links to the fake news websites we had. All right, the second thing we learned is that the people who were sharing these links to fake news websites were not liberals or moderates. These were people who had self-declared ideology as conservatives or very conservative. And again, we know this because we had surveyed them and we had asked them to identify their ideology. Now, there are a couple different ways you could read this chart. One way to read this chart is to say conservatives have a greater propensity for sharing fake news. The other way to read this chart, however, is that this may have been a supply issue. And we know from lots of other research that the vast majority of fake news in the 2016 elections had a pro-Trump bent to it. There was much, much less fake news that was anti-Trump or was pro-Clinton. So this may very well have been a supply side issue, but this is what the facts are in this regard, that the vast majority of the fake news was not being shared by liberals or moderates. However, the most interesting finding we came to, which holds when we control for whether or not you're a liberal, moderate, Republican, Democrat, is that it was people over 65 who were much more likely to be on average sharing more links to fake news websites. And indeed, when you compare in our survey, the folks who were, first of all, two things stand out right here. One, the relationship is what we call monotonic, it's increasing. So the older you get, the more links to fake news websites on average that you were sharing. What's particularly dramatic about this is that we found that this over 65 age group was sharing on average 7 times as many links to the fake news websites as was the 18 to 29-year-old group. And this is important because if you go back to those first days after 2016, when people began to get aware, we first become aware of fake news, one of the biggest things you heard about was, millennials and these young kids who are on social media. And I don't know, I mean, I have high school age children. I don't know if any of the rest of you do, but what we immediately saw after this was the introduction of digital literacy classes in middle schools, in high schools, right? And I'm all for digital literacy classes. I'm a huge fan of digital literacy classes for high schoolers. But one of the things we learned from this chart is that if we want to address the issue of who's sharing false information online, simply dealing with younger people is not going to be what gets at the heart of this problem. And indeed, in this particular case, the kids are all right in this regard. Okay, so now let's segue away from the issue of fake news generally to thinking about social media's overall relationship with this topic of polarization and political polarization. So we might wonder, what is the impact of social media usage on political polarization? After all, we know that in the social media era, Political polarization has gone up a great deal in the United States and in lots of other countries in the world. Of course, a lot of things have happened in the last 10, 15 years in the social media era. But it's a legitimate question to begin to ask, what is the impact of social media usage on political polarization? Well, one way we can study this and try to figure out what's the impact of social media usage on political polarization is we can try to take Facebook or other forms of social media. We can enroll people in experiments where people who are already using Facebook, we take the use of Facebook away from them. And then we can see, is there a difference after this period of time when people are off social media? Is there a difference in whatever it is that we're interested in, which could be in this particular case, political polarization? Now, there was an interesting study that was done of this in the United States that found in the United States, taking people, I'll come to that in 1 second. But the basic idea, the way that this works, is that you recruit people for an experiment. And the experiment that I'm going to tell you about, we actually ran not in the United States, but we ran in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And we were interested in this in Bosnia-Herzegovina for a couple of reasons. But one reason is that most of the studies that have been done in this regard had been done in the US. And so we wanted to see what happened in a post-conflict society. The second thing was we actually ran this study during a period of genocide commemoration. So a period where we thought that ethnic relations would be particularly heightened in the country. And the third is we wanted to look at polarization in a context that was not partisanship, but in terms of ethnic polarization. So the way that these kinds of experiments work is that we recruit people. So if you look at the left-hand side of this figure, it starts off with an ad on Facebook where we recruit people to participate in the study. And then after they participate in the study, they take a survey. And then after they take a survey, they're randomly assigned to be put into this group that stays on social media or this group that goes off of social media. And in this particular case, we took them off of social media for a week in Bosnia during a period of genocide commemoration. Now, Nela Asimovic, who's the student, a PhD student at the Center for Social Media and Politics, who you see pictured here in this picture, was the lead author on this particular study. And what you see in her hand here, just to pause for 1 second for just a kind of amusing anecdote, in order to get people to participate in these kinds of studies, you have to compensate them for participating. And one of the ways, the way that we're able to pay people in Bosnia was to give them mobile phone credit. So we were able to give mobile phone credit to the people participating in our study. And we thought that we could go to a single store and purchase the mobile phone credit for the over 300 people who were participating in our study. But on the day that Nela went to go pay the participants, we discovered, much to our chagrin, that you could only, in Sarajevo, where she was located in Bosnia, you could only put mobile phone credit on 10 cards at one particular store. And there's probably good reasons for purposes of preventing money laundering why these rules were in place. So Nela ended up spending the entire day running around Sarajevo, going to kiosk and store after store. She eventually recruited her father to help her in order to get through all the stores. And what you see a picture here is of a very exhausted PhD student at the end of the day, showing the very many receipts that she had acquired over that day, paying our subjects for participating. So even when you're doing online research and studying online behaviors, there are still very exciting and stressful moments of fieldwork that get involved in this. So just to give you a little bit of background behind this study. All right. So what did we learn? Well, we found a very surprising result. As I said, my colleague Hunt Alcott at NYU and his collaborator Matt Genskow at Stanford had previously run a similar study in the United States. And they found in their US study that taking people off of Facebook decreased people's knowledge of political news. It increased feelings of well-being, so people were less anxious, less depressed. And it decreased political polarization. Well, when we ran the study in Bosnia, we replicated their first two findings. So taking people off of social media made them less knowledgeable about current events. It also did, although not quite to the extent, but it did increase their feelings of well-being. We found people were a little less anxious being off social media for a week. But we found, much to our surprise, that in Bosnia, taking people off of social media actually increased ethnic polarization. So it increased dislike of the ethnic outgroup. And for those of you not familiar with Bosnia, Bosnia has 3 different ethnic groups. It has the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosnian Muslims, who are known as the Bosniaks. And so we found that the people who came off of social media increased their level of ethnic polarization relative to their compatriots who stayed on social media. So this was a puzzle. And we sort of wondered, why could this have happened? And so the first thing we did afterwards was we looked and saw what people were doing during the time that they were offline. And if you look at the chart here on the left, you find the number one thing that we asked people, what did you do with this extra time that you were normally on Facebook? The number one answer was to spend time with friends and family. And we began to think, what if what was happening was that during this period of genocide commemoration, the people who were normally exposed to folks from other ethnic groups online, maybe they were only spending time with their own ethnic group offline. And we thought, if this is the case, then we should see this effect being stronger in parts of the country where people live in ethnically homogenous, so ethnically similar areas, than in the parts of the country where people live in more ethnically mixed areas. Now, those of you who know the sort of tragic history of Bosnia-Herzegovina over the past 2 decades know that this was a country where a great deal of ethnic cleansing took place, and there are lots of people who live in very ethnically homogenous or ethnically similar areas of the country. And the graph on the right, which has a lot of stuff going on in it, but all you really need to know is that we have split people out into people who live in homogenous parts of the country and people who live in more mixed part of the countries. And those dots with the arrow, with the lines coming out of the lines sort of show you how much uncertainty we have about our estimate, and the circle or the triangle, that shows us our estimate of the effect. And what you should see here is that in the areas that are mixed, those lines and those dots are all right over 0. And in the areas which are ethnically similar, these effects are negative. And what are these effects? These are the effects on your sense of positive feeling about your ethnic outgroup. And so we see that this effect, this surprising effect that we found, that people who came off of seeing on social media kept people having a better view of their ethnic outgroups, or put the other way, the people who came off social media had a worse view of their outgroups. This was entirely driven by the people who lived in ethnically homogenous areas of the country. Places where during this period of ethnic genocide commemoration, by being off social media, they may have lost their chance to see other people's perspectives on it and only talked about it with their people in their offline networks who were all from the same ethnic group. So this is a second really big takeaway point to take out of this talk, is that it is very popular now to be talking about social media's effect on society and social media's effect on polarization. But we have to remember that people live, yes, more and more of their lives, and especially during the pandemic, people do live online, but people also live their lives offline. And in the United States, we know that people's offline worlds have become increasingly politically segregated. As you have more and more liberals living in cities, you have more and more conservatives in rural areas, but even in the areas around cities, there's been amazing work done on this. So it's important when you think about social media to think about not as an own isolated online world, but as people who live in both online and offline worlds. All right, so now let's moving on, now that we're on to sort of pernicious things that can happen on social media. One of the biggest things that people have been concerned about is hate speech. And for anyone who's ever encountered this on social media, it can be a very awful, awful experience. It's an awful experience to be attacked using hate speech. It's an awful experience to watch people using hate speech online. But one of the biggest narratives that came out of the Donald Trump campaign in 2016 was how much Trump had normalized hate speech online. And the argument became, and you saw lots of different headlines like this in the aftermath of the 2016 elections, as we look at this one at the bottom, massive rise in hate speech on Twitter during the presidential election. So much so that I think, at least in my communities, in my neighborhoods, this was taken as received wisdom, that this was something that had absolutely happened. And we decided at the Center for Social Media and Politics, we were actually asked to come to a conference that was right after the election. And we were asked to present some research. And actually it's from the co-author of the book, Nate Persley, who had invited me to present at Stanford at a conference. I said, oh, we have some really interesting work on echo chambers that we just published. And he said, no, I want something new. And we thought, what can we do really new? We said, well, we have a lot of data, lots and lots of Twitter data about what people tweeted during the election. We can go and we can find this rise in hate speech that people are talking about online, and we can document it. So we set out with the following question, which was, to what extent did online hate speech and white nationalist rhetoric on Twitter increase over the course of Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and in the aftermath of his election in 2016? Eventually, this project would go on to include data from 2 years. So we had data from when Trump declared in the summer of June of 2015, all the way through the first 9 months in office in June 2017. And we stopped there solely because when you do this kind of research, you have to stop somewhere, because otherwise you never write up your results, you never actually publish the articles, and you can never give talks like this. So we ended up with 2 years of data and almost 1.2 billion tweets. So that's billion with a B. And for those of you not familiar with Twitter, although it's hard to imagine after the Trump administration, anyone is not familiar with Twitter, but to the extent that you may or may not be, it's a micro-blogging service where people are able to put sort of short, it was at the time 140 character statements, now it's 280 character statements. They can have links in them, they can have pictures in them, and they're almost all entirely shared publicly. And we had collected a number of different collections during the 2016 elections. One which we called our political Twitter collection, which contained 150 million tweets that referenced Hillary Clinton or one of her campaign slogans, and 600 million tweets that referenced Donald Trump or one of his campaign slogans. As an aside, it is not going to be the point of my discussion, but it is incredible to note that we collected, just by using keywords like Hillary, take all tweets that have Hillary Clinton in them, we ended up with 4 times as many tweets about Donald Trump as we did about Hillary Clinton. So that gives a sense of the way in which he was sort of sucking the oxygen out of the Twitter sphere. But we also collected what we call our random sample of American Twitter users, which is we painstakingly built up a random sample of about 500,000 US Twitter users, and we collected all of their tweets over this time period. So that's another additional 400 million tweets. So the research that I'm talking about here, it draws on this almost 1.2 billion tweets over this 2-year period. Okay, so the method of analysis that we used to do this is we did 2 things. One is we used what's called a dictionary-based method. So we started with a lot of words that other outside organizations who study hate speech, who study hateful language, had developed. So we were like lists that were developed, say, by the Anti-Defamation League or lists by other scholars. So we started out with dictionaries, and we took all the tweets that had one of these words that was identified as a hateful word in it. But it turned out that when you did that, a lot of words that show up as potentially hateful words are not always used in that manner. Sometimes, in the most extreme manners, they're used to denounce hateful speech, but other times they're just used in all sorts of different ways. And so, for example, the word taco is an anti-Latino slur, but most of the time when people use it on Twitter, they're talking about food, they're not using it as a slur. So we used machine learning methods to remove the false positives. So that's one way we did it with dictionaries. But then as the study went on, we became thought, well, maybe we're missing the way people actually use hateful language online. And you might have heard about before, like that there were some right-wing nationalist groups in the United States who were identifying Jews by putting 3 parentheses around them. So that kind of a thing wouldn't show up in a hate speech dictionary. So we did a second method, which I'm happy to talk more about during the question and answer if people are interested in. But we essentially went to some places online where we knew people were using hateful speech. And for that, we went to a platform called Reddit. And we went to discussion boards that were known to be repositories of white nationalist speech or anti-African American speech or all sorts of different kind of speech that you really don't want to be reading. And we were able to use natural language processing measures to measure the semantic similarity between language on Twitter and language in these known repositories of hate speech. So as I said, I'm happy to talk much more about these methods during the Q&A if people are interested. But the best thing to know from here is we use 2 very different methods. One starting with dictionary words, the others trying to use sort of more sophisticated models of what we knew what hate speech looked like on the internet, and then seeing as time went by, each day's tweets, did they look more like the hate speech, that those repositories of hate speech on the internet. All right, so what did we find? Well, what were we looking for? So let's imagine that we have a simple graph where I've put up here today, where time is the x-axis and the prevalence of hate speech is the y-axis. And this red dotted line is the election day. So recall, we have all these claims right here, the massive rise in hate speech on Twitter during the presidential election. So we imagine there could be 2 things we're looking for. One thing we might have been looking for is a kind of steady increase over time, as Trump first declared that if Trump's continuing success during the primaries and the election was sort of normalizing, was creating acceptance among the general population for the use of hate speech online, you could see something like this. Over time, hate speech would go up. However, it's also possible, if some of you like me, in the aftermath of, you heard all these sort of horror stories that happened right after the election, it's also possible that what might have happened is something more like this, that it was the actual election of Donald Trump. When he got elected, people said, oh my God, he's actually won. We're living in this different world. It's a different America than I expected. And then people felt comfortable using this hateful language. So one of these two patterns was what we were looking for, either a kind of a steady increase or some sort of dramatic discontinuity and increase around election day. Well, this is actually what we found. So this is a huge summary of across our over 1 billion tweets over a 2-year period of our monthly proportion of tweets that contained hate speech. And what we see here is, in the red here is our Trump sample, the blue is our Clinton sample, the green is our random sample. We don't see anything that looks like either of those two pictures I've just shown you. We don't see a dramatic increase after the election, and we don't see a steady increase over the course of the election. What we see is something more like a little bit of a random walk around a basic mean. We do see a slight uptick in the Trump collection in the aftermath of his election. That actually turns out to be all about the implementation of the Muslim travel ban. And in the aftermath of that, that was the first time Hillary Clinton spoke up in the aftermath of the election, as well as a firing of the acting attorney general, both of whom were women. And this is all essentially misogynistic speech at that particular moment. Let's dive into this a little bit more in detail. If you look at this particular figure, now you're not going to be able to read the language on it. This may have been one of the more depressing figures I've ever made in my career, but we actually broke down all of our different dictionaries into anti-Asian hate speech, anti-Black hate speech, anti-immigrant hate speech, etc. Each one of these graphs is a different type of hate speech, and the one in the lower right-hand corner is white nationalist language online. The reason I'm showing you all 9 of these charts with fonts that you probably can't read is because the point I want to make is that in none of these cases do we see a picture of rising hate speech over the course of the 2016 election or a dramatic increase after the 2016 election. Instead, we see, and we'll zoom in here just so you can get a sense of this, this is anti-Muslim hate speech. Now maybe you can read the font a little bit more. What we see is a pattern in mathematics that's known as burstiness. We see a sort of general underlying level of anti-Muslim hate speech punctuated by short bursts of huge increases. Now, one of these in here is following the Bataclan nightclub shooting, if you remember this in Paris. And this is a long recognized pattern that goes far beyond the research we did here, which is that when you have terrorist attacks by Islamist terrorist groups, you get bursts of hate speech, anti-Islamic hate speech online. But so what we find across all of these cases are pictures that look like this. So the results of this study was that, contrary to the received wisdom, our analysis does not show a systematic increase in hate speech over the course of the campaign or after the election. Similarly, there are no significant increases in white nationalist rhetoric over the course of the campaign. Instead, hate speech over the 2016 election campaign is bursty, but not significantly increasing or decreasing. And this is important because we think it's very important that people know this, because if you live in a world where the dominant media narrative is that hate speech is increasing, that more and more people are using hateful language, more and more people are sharing hateful ideologies, that has the possibility to become self-fulfilling. And especially we worry about young people growing up thinking this is a norm. But if what's happening here is that we have a media narrative about increases in hate speech, and hate speech itself is not actually increasing, which is not to say, by the way, we are making no normative statement about the level at which we found. We found plenty of hate speech. We found plenty of horrible stuff out there. But this narrative about it becoming more popular does not seem to be underlined by fact. And we think it's important that this is something that's known. All right. Speaking of this final topic of importance about, pushing back on narratives that are out there, the final piece of research that I'm going to show you today is, and this is sort of hot off the presses here, which is about the effect of the 2016 Russian IRA intervention in the US elections. As you probably know by this point, there were a whole bunch of Russian accounts that were being run out of St. Petersburg that were pretending to be US accounts. And the research and the security community has learned a lot about what happened here. We learned who was doing this, a group called the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. We learned what they were doing, running these social media campaigns. We've learned even a lot about the strategies they've done. We have other reports that I don't have time to talk about here, but I could talk about in Q&A, that where we analyzed what sort of links these accounts were sharing. We learned they were doing things like sharing local news. Other scholars have shown how they embedded in themselves in communities like Black Lives Matter, how they played both the left and the right, and they played to different types of trolls. And we've learned about who is exposed to these trolls. But what we haven't learned until now is anything about the impact of exposure to these trolls. So I'm going to show you some incredibly fresh information about what we've learned from this study. And again, the way we did this was relying on our 2016 SMAP election panel. And we surveyed people at the beginning of the campaign, right before the election, and we also served them, we got their vote choice from after the election. And about 1,500 people who were on this survey had shared their Twitter handle with us. And we were able, therefore, because Twitter data is public, we were able to find out who all of those people were following. And we could also find out all the tweets, collect all the tweets from all the people they were following. Now, these tweets, in sum total, again, came up to about 1.2 billion tweets from the feeds of these respondents. Twitter, much to their credit, actually released all of the tweets by Russian IRA trolls, which means that we could go into for our panelists, we could go look at the accounts that they followed, and we know all the tweets from the accounts they followed. So we know if they followed one of these trolls, but more importantly, we know if anyone else they followed retweeted one of the trolls' tweets. So we knew essentially every tweet that could, from a Russian troll, that could have come across the timeline of our panelists. And our data, we asked them about their attitudes towards issues and their preferences for candidates at the beginning of the election. Then we know all the tweets they saw from these trolls, and then we ask them these questions again at the end of the election. All right, so what did we learn? The first thing is, if you look at panel A on the top here, we learned that actually, if you just think of it in sort of gross numbers, it looks like people were exposed to not a trivial number, a non-trivial number of tweets from these Russian trolls. That as we got close to the election, the average person in our sample was seeing between 5 and 7 tweets from these trolls a day, or potentially seeing, it was coming in their feed. However, and here we go back to the power law, if we look at B, in particular, panel B here, what we learn is that 1% of our respondents accounted for 75% of these potential exposures. And when we look at, on the x-axis, 10% of our respondents accounted for 99% of these exposures. So again, 90% of our respondents saw barely anything from these particular Russian trolls. Now, the other thing we could do is we could compare how much they saw information from Russian trolls to things like other sources of information about the election. So we looked at their exposure. On the far right here, you have on the top the mean number of exposure to trolls, and on the bottom you have the median. However, if you look at politicians in the middle, you can see that that's orders of magnitude higher than of their exposure to Russian trolls. And then if you throw in the news media on the left here, you see not only is the exposure to Russian trolls dwarfed by politicians and news media, it's dwarfed by huge factors. They are seeing many, 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 many more tweets about politics from media, from politicians than our respondents are from Russian trolls. All right, who's exposed? What we found is that the people who were exposed to these trolls were actually the people you would have expected to vote for Trump already. So we found they were the strong Republicans, and then in particular men were the folks who were exposed to these Russian trolls. There's a lot going on in this chart. I'm going to give you the takeaway from it. There's almost no impact whatsoever on people's polarization, on people's attitudes about issues. And then the takeaway thing here is that we find zero impact for the exposures to these tweets on anyone's preferred vote choice, looking at the difference between who they preferred in the beginning of the campaign to who they preferred at the end. So what do we know now? We know that there was non-trivial exposure to these trolls, but it was heavily concentrated, and among those who are most likely to support Trump, there was orders of magnitude more exposure to media and politicians. And so when you think about that, when you think about how hard it is to change anyone's vote in the United States, it's not surprising there was sort of no systematic effect on issue polarization and no systematic effect on vote choice, which leaves us with the fear that the lasting impact of the Russian campaign in 2016, the impact of it was not in changing anyone's vote in 2016, but in creating a narrative that it was possible to easily change election results. Because we heard a lot about afterwards about how much Russian interference may have impacted the election. And while there are some very sophisticated arguments that are made by other colleagues of ours, including Kathleen Hall Jameson at the Penn Annenberg School, about other things the Russians did, hacking and releasing emails and changing media narratives, in a lot of people's heads, these social media is associated with potentially changing outcome of 2016 election. We worry that the long-term impact of this campaign was then to actually set the groundwork for the big lie in 2020, when Trump claimed that the election was fraudulent, when of course it wasn't, but people may have been conditioned to think, well, it's easy enough to change the outcome of the election when it really wasn't. So again, why we think this kind of research is so important to set the record straight. We wish we could have come out with this 4 years ago, but unfortunately it's taken us a long time to do the work. Okay, so if you're interested in all this, I wanna just quickly give a plug for the book that was mentioned in the kind introduction at the beginning that we recently brought out, called Social Media and Democracy, The State of the Field and Prospects for Reform, that I edited with Nate Persley, that we released this summer. This book goes through, I've only scratched the surface in what, this is all just stuff we've learned in my lab about social media and democracy, but we have 7 great chapters summarizing sort of more research like this on topics like misinformation and echo chambers. And Alex Siegel, who was the lead author on the hate speech paper you saw here, she wrote a chapter on hate speech. We've got stuff on political advertising. We've got things on correcting misinformation. And then in the second half of the book, we have 4 chapters on policy reform. My colleague, Nate Persley, who co-edited this with me, is a professor at Stanford Law School. So he got a great collection of writers to write about policy implications and different types of prospects for reform. But I want to spend my last minute here just talking about the final chapter of this book, which Nate and I wrote, which was called The Challenges and Opportunities for Social Media Research. And that chapter is all about the importance of access to data. Everything that I've shown you here today, I think, is important for informing citizens like you about what the impact of social media is on a democracy. I don't have to tell the League of Women Voters, this is a time that is fraught with questions about regulation, moving forward, all sorts of issues about what is going to be public policy around the platforms. And I want to make a very strong plea that whether you come from a left-wing perspective and have left-wing policy solutions to problems, or a right-wing perspective and have right-wing policy solutions to problems, I would hope everybody would agree that you would want to layer your policy solutions on a common grounding of an understanding of what's actually happening online. And I hope just a little bit today, I've been able to show you this sort of how difficult it is to go about and do this research, how easy it is for received wisdom to take hold. Somebody says something, it gets written up in an opinion column, it gets repeated by pundits, and how quickly these things can take hold. But when you do the actual sort of hard, rigorous scientific research, you learn that the underlying reality can be different. And we want our public policy to be based on the underlying reality, not the stories that are told by pundits that may be particularly salacious or easy to grasp. And the only way that that's going to happen is if people who put their findings into the public domain are given access to this data. I've told you about creative ways that we've been able to go about doing this, but the reality is we live in a world, Nate and I call it the best of times and the worst of times for social media research. Sorry, for social science research, which is we have more data about human behavior than we've ever had before in the history of social science by orders of magnitude, which gives us the opportunity for incredible scientific discovery about all sorts of things. But that includes understanding what I've been trying to talk to you about today, social media platforms' impact on society and on our political world. However, it's the worst of times because people like me, the way we used to get access to data is it would be government data like election results and unemployment figures, or it'd be data we got created ourselves, like by surveying, doing games with students in labs or running surveys. Today, this data is owned by giant, powerful, and a small number of companies. And to the extent that we lock that data inside those companies, what it means is that this incredible data source that we need to understand and to make the correct public policy decisions, that data will be used in the short term for one purpose and one purpose only, which is maximizing the profits of already huge behemoth companies. And in the longer term, it'll be used for whatever those companies want. And it's only through public policy that we are going to be able to ensure that people who will use that data to advance scientific knowledge, to advance our understanding of the way the world is working in this digital era that we live in today, who are incentivized and agree to put that information into the public domain. And I would argue that academic researchers play a very special role in this case, because unlike the people who work for the platforms who are obligated to maximize shareholder value, unlike entrepreneurs who may be wanting to start their own companies, even unlike nonprofits who have all sorts of very good goals, but they are not obligated to put what they've learned into the public domain, academic researchers, our currency, the way we get, everyone says publish or perish, but the point of that is publish is about putting stuff into the public domain. And so I'm happy to talk much more about this during the Q&A if there's interest here, but I would urge you, those of you who are involved with government, who think about regulation, who are thinking about regulating the platforms, simply splitting up Facebook into its component parts of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp is not necessarily going to solve problems. It's not necessarily going to inform the public about what's happening. And this is, I think, very crucial for policymaking going forward. All right, I'm over time now already. So I want to just close by noting that the work that I've done, that I've presented to you here today, this comes out of the Center for Social Media and Politics. It's all collaborative work that involves lots of different people working really, really hard, from graduate students to other faculty to research engineers. These are the pictures of the folks who contributed to the papers that you saw here today. So I want to thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to discussing, answering your questions going forward. And thanks so much for inviting me here today.
Well, my head is spinning, that's for sure. That's a lot of information. And yes, we have a lot of questions. Thank you so much for that informative, and I don't know if it's depressing or not depressing findings. I guess it doesn't sound like that many people really respond that much to these social medias. Is that what you're saying to me?
Oh, no, I'm not saying, I wouldn't want to say at all that people don't respond to things. I think that I think a lot of what we think we know turns out to not necessarily be the case when we do deeper dives into what's going on. So, so the hate speech one is a fantastic example. I think if I had surveyed lots of people and asked them, did hate speech online increase over the course of the Trump campaign? Most people would think, over the 2016 election campaign, I think most people would think that that was absolutely the case and that that's what had happened. Mm-hmm. And yet that's not what we found when we went in and did the actual analysis of it. So, but it's not to say that social media doesn't matter. We think social media does, social media can matter in a lot of ways, although I would argue that I think probably we think social media matters too much, and we sometimes forget about the offline world in which people live as well, where a lot of very important things are happening, as exemplified par excellence by COVID and these dramatic changes to people's lives that happened because of development in the offline world, not the online world.
That was just my personal question. Actually, we have a lot of other people's questions here. First question is, bots send us much fake news. This person believes it's important that Americans understand that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We are currently at work on a book project trying to understand what exactly it is that bots did over the course of the 2016 elections. And so we're deep into that research. Doing research on bots is complicated because you first have to do the research to identify bots. So we've done quite a lot of work on bots in Russian politics. And I'll just share a couple of interesting things we learned about bots in Russian politics. So as I said, we're very interested in how authoritarian regimes respond to online opposition. And my background before I came to studying social media and politics was actually in post-communist politics. And one of the most fascinating things we've learned, we've done these expansive studies of Russian bots. So these are actually bots that tweet in Russian, aimed at a Russian domestic audience. And one of the most fascinating things we found is that they were tweeting loads of links to loads of newspaper story headlines. Some of them had links to those headlines. That makes sense. You're trying to direct people to news. But actually, it turned out that lots of them were tweeting headlines without links, which really had us scratching our heads when we first discovered this. But as time went on, what we began to think is that what was going on here is that the bots might not actually, their primary audience might not be human beings. What the bots might be trying to do is fool algorithms like Google. So there's a kind of Russian Google that's called Yandex. And Yandex for a long time had a feature which was the most popular news stories. And what we think was happening with these bots is that the bots were actually trying to trick the Yandex algorithm into thinking these stories were more popular than they were, so that they could manipulate they could manipulate what the headlines were and what were the things that were showing up on the Yandex website. So it's a big open question what it is bots are trying to do and what bots' main audience is. But we hope to learn more about this in the future. But yes, absolutely, I think that bots are an important part of the fake news ecosystem in the extent that they're trying to draw attention. A lot of what the fake news can be about political motives, as we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election, where the fake news was the big lie about the election. But it can also have economic motives, where it's an attempt to just bring people to websites, to click on websites so that people can earn money off of those particular websites. All right, I see there's a lot of other questions, so I'll leave it there.
Okay. The next question is, did your study show how people became more critical of news?
That is a great question. And this is actually something we've been quite worried about, because in the aftermath, right, of the explosion of fake news, there has been a ton of discussion about what are the remedies that you can take. Like I mentioned, teaching digital literacy to high schoolers, which is something that I don't think anyone would think is particularly controversial. We have done a number of different studies. That's not what I decided to talk about today. I have another talk of this length where I go into great detail about all the work that we're doing around fake news beyond the sharing of fake news. But I'll share, if you give me just a minute here, I'll share a couple things from this. So what we've been particularly interested in is people's ability to identify the veracity of news in real time. So we've built some pipelines where we collect the most popular news stories that have appeared in the last 24 hours, and we send them out to ordinary citizens to assess their veracity, whether they're true, whether they're false or misleading, or whether they can't tell. And we also send those articles out to professional fact checkers so that we can have a ground truth, right? Was the article true? Was it false or misleading? Or was it too hard to tell from the article? And we've done a ton of research. I could talk to you for a whole other hour about all the work that we've done on that. But one thing that's sort of very interesting to share about this is that one of the things that we asked people to do in that particular study was to go, before they told us whether they thought it was true or false, we asked them to go out on the internet and search for information that told them before they made their assessment. And that's something that's part of a lot of digital literacy processes, right? Like you should go out and don't just believe something you see, you should try to figure out whether it's true or not. Well, the problem, what was interesting was that for the stories that were true, that our professional fact checkers rated as true, when people went out and searched for that information, they actually found they got it correct more often. They realized that it was true more often. The problem was when it was false, they also thought it was true more often. So actually, when people went out and searched for information about false news stories, they did worse. So that's the opposite of the problem that you're talking about here, which is if you keep warning people about the prevalence of fake news, are they going to be more suspicious of actual true news? I will say one intervention that we've tested, we've done a bunch of interventions where we've tested, which we've been quite depressed about the results. But one thing that we've tested that has been positive is there's an online news service or online service you can sign up for, and you have to pay for it now. It was originally free, called NewsGuard, which will actually kind of give you like a little green, when you do a Google search or when you're on Facebook and you see a link to a news site, it'll give you a little green shield if it's a news site that it's rated as credible, and it'll give you a red shield if it's one that it's rated as being problematic. And in that particular case, we did the same kind of study that I've talked to you about today, where we survey people at the beginning, we then randomly assign them to get the intervention or not. In this case, it's the use of NewsGuard. And in this particular case, we installed browser software, so we knew where people were traveling. And we did find that with this NewsGuard system installed, people tended to go to more trustworthy websites over time, which was really interesting and encouraging. But B, they actually ended up getting better at identifying fake news without getting worse at identifying true news. So it is a concern. And anytime anybody comes to me and tells me that they have some new system for informing people about the prevalence of fake news or all the fake news that's out there, this is the first question. I'm worried that it's going to make people more skeptical of true news. And again, we are living in this era of the big lie, right? Where we have this crazy situation where 70% of Republicans will report believing that the election was fraudulent, despite the fact that there were 60 court cases saying that the election wasn't fraudulent. There's no documented evidence of any fraud having any meaningful impact on it. And part of that problem, I suggested earlier in this talk, may have been that we spent a lot of time after 2016 talking about the ability for a foreign power to change the outcome of an election, right? So that might have seeded people to thinking the elections could be manipulated in these ways. But it might also be this case after years and years of fake news where you say, no, 60 court cases. Oh, well, that's just the mainstream media reporting on 60 court cases. So we continue to worry about this, and this is something that scholars continue to look into. That's why I think it's very important to do this kind of rigorous testing and evaluation of these potential interventions before they're rolled out at large scale.
Okay, here's another one. What about the dark web? Have the haters left mainstream social media to avoid criticism, watchful eyes, and academic studies like yours?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's something that was brought up by academic audiences as well whenever we showed those charts, right? So just to go back, I'll just throw that back up there. When you look at figures, whoops. Oh, sorry, give me one second. Oh, all right, I'm not going to throw that up. When you look at the figures that we showed you, where you see that like over the time of the election, there's the same basic levels of hate speech, right? There are a couple of different ways that could happen, right? It could be the case that actually it's just, the same people who are using hateful speech are kind of using hateful speech over the same time period, and it isn't really an increase in the amount of people. And in fact, I showed you about hateful tweets per month, but we reran all these analyses also by the number of people who were doing hateful tweets per month. We did it the total number, and no matter what you did it, you get these relatively flat patterns. And you're absolutely right. One way we could get that result would be if every month a bunch of people are leaving Twitter and going to another platform, and they're being replaced by even more people who stay on Twitter who are now willing to use hateful language who didn't previously. There's a couple of problems with that. One is Occam's razor, which is that usually the simplest explanation for things are the true explanations. That's a pretty complex story that's balancing out all correctly in the aggregate. The other is that we continue to see this movie, right? Like in that we hear that everybody's going to leave Twitter and Facebook, or conservatives are going to leave Twitter and Facebook for other platforms. First, it was a platform called Gab that we heard a lot about. Lately, it was a platform called Parler, which got a lot of play in the immediate period after the election and then around the time of the insurrection. The issue here, though, is that as hard as it is, you are the League of Women Voters. I'm a political science professor. We think people live and breathe politics all of the time. But the reality is, one lesson I've learned from my entire career being someone who studies political behavior is you can never go wrong by underestimating the amount of time that people actually spend thinking about politics, right? Most people do not spend much time in their lives thinking about politics. Most people are not paying attention to it, notwithstanding everybody who's in the room tonight. And so what ends up happening is that, yes, there is a small number of people that they are on social media for reasons of politics. And those people might actually make the choice that there are other places they would rather have these political discussions uninhibited. But most folks are on Facebook not only because they want to discuss far-right politics, but also because they want to know what their high school friends are up to, or they want to know what's going on, they want to see pictures of their cousin's kids. And this leads us to a concept known as network effects, which is there are a bunch of different types of businesses which gain their value from how the more people that are involved with them, the more they're worth. And we continuously see monopolies kind of developing in these areas. Think about things like Airbnb, right? Airbnb is only valuable if there are lots of options on it. Facebook is only valuable if there are tons of people on it. You jump on Facebook, you can find your high school friends, you can find your family, your college friends, you can find your kids, the people who are on your kids, the parents of your kids' soccer team, right? Like my daughter is about to go to college. What did we just hear from one of the college things? You need to reach out to the Facebook groups of college parents, right? Those things don't exist on Parler. they don't exist on Gab. And what we seem to find happening with these giant social media platforms is every time we say, oh, lots of people are going to leave because they don't like X political factor, it ends up not really happening because these huge networks can deliver things that smaller networks just can't. Now, maybe we'll see this tested again. There are all sorts of rumors that Donald Trump is going to start a social media network. But if I was a betting person, I would bet the same, very similar thing would end up happening with that as well. Although who knows, Trump has shattered a lot of expectations in the past. So maybe he's the one person who can kind of pull this off. Now, I want to be very, very careful here because I don't want anyone to walk away from this talk today and say, oh, we saw this professor from NYU come in who told us hate speech is not a problem on the internet. It is a problem. And it can be a problem for lots and lots of different ways. As I said, we found lots of hate speech. We just didn't find that it went up at that point in time. And that's the same thing about this dark web. Even if large numbers of people are not moving to the dark web, what we have learned from the Capitol insurrection, what we have learned from the horrendous shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, is that you don't need a majority of the population to believe in an ideology for people to die and for violent acts to be conducted. And if you go all the way back to the talk, again, the same thing that helps pro-democracy activists, you can find people who are not geographically proximate to you who share your beliefs. This can be a wonderful thing if you're trying to overthrow a repressive dictatorship. But it can also be a horrible thing, as we saw in that Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, right? Where we know this was a person who was egged on by other people on Gab who went and found people who shared these kind of horrible anti-Semitic attitudes. And it ended deadly, as did the Capitol insurrection. And so, you know, I think a lot of the hate speech research in particular is important because it shows that these narratives are not necessarily the narratives of the majority of society. And that's important to know. Because when they get picked up, one of the things, going back to the beginning of the talk, right, like in democratic societies, not only can non-democratic forces use the same affordances of social media that help pro-democracy activists in authoritarian regimes, the ability to communicate, to plan, but they can also use the tools developed by the authoritarian regimes to amplify their voices, the bots that the first question was asking about, trolls. You can use these things to make small fringes of the population appear much, much larger and more powerful than they are. I mean, think about it this way. In Charlottesville, Virginia, there were hundreds of people who showed up for these kind of neo-Nazi, far-right, you know, fascist-y type protests. The Women's March, right, got like 4.2 million people to show up for it. That was like 1,000 times larger, but the two have probably gotten the same amount of media attention and media discussion. And so in your mind, you think, okay, right, there's this Women's March, but there's also the Charlottesville people. But there were 1,000 times as many people at the Women's March than there were in Charlottesville, probably even more than that. So I think that's the kind of things that we have to calibrate and then we have to be careful about calibrating. But it doesn't mean it's not pernicious, right? And going to the dark web can be really, really bad for planning terrorist attacks. Say what you will about Twitter, it's public. People like me can go in and find out what's going on, right? When these folks leave Twitter and they go hide other places, right, in the darker web, you don't know what's going on. And it depends what your concern is. If your concern is surfacing plots, understanding strategies, you want people in a more public area. If your concern is recruitment and that people are going to spread their ideology and they're going to normalize hate, then you want them, you'd much rather have them in a dark corner talking to the few other people who share their views than radicalizing a generation of younger people.
Okay, time is running out, so we're going to have one more question. And there are lots more, but we just don't have time for them. The one question that this is kind of interesting. In studying social media, does looking at one platform like Twitter accurately reflect all platforms? If not Twitter, is there another one?
What a fantastic question. And I will close by, so the answer is no, it doesn't. And this is, and actually in the prior incarnation of this book that we just published was something that was published by the Hewlett Foundation, a report I coordinated for the Hewlett Foundation, got a great collection of younger scholars to help me out on this. And we issued this report, which is called Social Media, Political Polarization and Disinformation or something like that. It's at the Hewlett Foundation. And one of the things they asked us to call, part of the thing we had to do in the report was talk about where the field needed to move. And at that point in time, especially, the vast majority of research on social media that had been done with Twitter. Now, why had it been done with Twitter data? Twitter is a pretty important platform for politics. That is where all the reporters hang out. It's a pretty important platform generally. About 20% of Americans are on Twitter. It's played an important role in organizing protests. But the real reason why everyone is doing all their research with Twitter data is because it was public. And Twitter, for reasons that were for other purposes, but Twitter made it fairly easy for for academics who were willing to be clever about this process to get access to the data they needed to do the research. And so ergo, the data was available, the data was public, that dealt with a whole other set of concerns, and it was important, and so people did their research on it. But of course, 80% of the country is on Facebook, right? YouTube is used by 80% of the country. People go to different platforms. TikTok is in the process of passing Twitter in popularity, is already way past Twitter in popularity among younger people. It's zooming up in terms of the number of users in the country. And that's where I ended my talk, right? We need your help. We need your help to be able to study these platforms. We know a lot more about Twitter because the data is more accessible. But Facebook data could be more accessible if there was legal regulation to make that data accessible. If there was resources and money put into creating safe, privacy protective, but legally mandated repositories of data. If you think about things needing to be deposited in the Library of Congress, you think about the census data, which we have come up with ways to allow people to study the census data while protecting the privacy of people who are involved in it. That's the only way we're going to know this. The other thing I will say is, and I know you have your League of Women Voters Gala coming up, but if anyone's interested in what we're doing, one of the things we're fundraising for right now at the Center for Social Media and Politics is we are trying to build a large-scale panel of people who will be compensated but contributing to a citizen science effort where they will be part of a panel, answer survey questions like the ones we needed to study the Russian trolls and to study who shared fake news on Facebook. But we've also built all these tools to allow people to share their social media data across lots of different platforms, Twitter data, Facebook data, YouTube data. And so we are looking for donors and funders at this point who will support us in trying to build out this panel, because we want to compensate the people who are participating in it. But it's that kind of research, and really we shouldn't be doing that. Right? The National Science Foundation should be doing this. These are the kind of things that government should be supporting, building up these kinds of panels, because you're absolutely right. No, we don't know, because something is happening on Twitter, what's going on, for example, WhatsApp, which is a totally different platform, right? Where messages are encrypted, where people are in chat groups most of the time, nor do we know what's going on TikTok, which is short form videos, right? Where lots and lots of people are getting information from in really, really rapid, fast time. And so that is a shortcoming in the field. The field's getting better. I'm really pleased to say that we now have multiple papers in our lab that's looking at YouTube. I'm chairing something called the Facebook 2020 Research Election Study, which is a large group of academics, not the Center for Social Media and Politics, but a large group of academics from across universities across the country that were involved with something called the Social Science One Initiative. There's about 17 academics working with a team inside of Facebook to try to study Facebook's impact on the 2020 elections. So there is movement in this regard. Some of my students are doing kind of incredible work with TikTok, which is super wild, wild west. It feels like Twitter studies from 10 years ago. And so the field is branching out, but it's tough. And we're at a precarious moment right now because there is going to be regulation around social media companies. And again, if I can urge if you think what you've learned here from me today is important, I mean, that older people sharing fake news on Facebook, that study was picked up in 200 countries around the world, right? Like that was something the world didn't know until we published that. And we only were able to publish it because we happened to be trying to study something else that allowed us to do this in retrospect. And without that, people might be thinking about the sharing of fake news totally differently around the world than how they do think about it. And so it is really, if you think the importance of the research that we're doing, what you've learned here is interesting, I would urge you in your policy capacities to be thinking about ways to encourage policymakers to continue to make this sort of data available for public-facing research.
Thank you so much for all the work, this wonderful, informative presentation. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's been a great pleasure. I will certainly take you up on your opportunity. There are all sorts of different types of legislation and ideas around legislation
That would be really important for us to know about.
think of a better ally to have in that regard than the League of Women Voters. So that's a wonderful offer. And thanks all of you for sharing some of your Tuesday evening here. It's been a real pleasure.